if you've been in this non-profit space for a while now, especially with the funding environment, then I'm sure this question has bothered you in one way or the other. In many times, as a CFO or as a head of finance, you see that your non-profit is actually attracting revenue. You're looking at your balance sheet, but you can't just take it away from your analysis that there's something that is fragile about the organization's financial status as a whole, but it's not just giving to you on the first phase. And that's what I call the balance sheet blind spots. So, in many cases, an organization can double its revenue. It will continue to receive clean audits with major international grants. So everything is playing as it should be. But still, as you look at things, it looks fragile. Yeah, yes, fragile. So there are situations where organizations expand across countries, grow program portfolios, and they even continue increasing headcount, but they are quietly weakening underneath. So after nearly 2 decades in non-profit financial leadership across multiple countries, operations, donor-funded environments, and complex regulatory systems, I have learned this, that revenue growth can be a very convincing illusion, because compliance is not the same as resilience, and a clean audit is not the same as capital strength. And if you are watching your income statement, you may be missing the real story. So today I want to talk about the balance sheet blind spots, those that destabilize otherwise impressive global non-profit. And so let's look at the illusion of growth. Growth feels good. More grants, more programs, more visibility, and more geographic expansions. Both celebrates that, donors applaud it, and leadership feels validated. But here's the question that we should ask executive teams in these scenarios. What is happening to your balance sheet while you are celebrating your income statement? So most nonprofit conversations, if you know, will revolve around budget versus actuals, burn rates, grant pipelines, and program delivery targets. Very few revolve around net asset composition, liquidity ratios, reserve adequacy, dependency exposure, and infrastructure capital. So I have had opportunities where interacting with organizations whose revenues had grown 40% plus in like 2 to 3 years. And on paper, it's very impressive. But if you look at the balance sheet, what was happening is that unrestricted reserves had declined, deferred revenue exposure had increased, and foreign exchange risk had doubled. So that is not growth. That is expansion sitting on structural thin ice. And thin ice looks solid until pressure hits it. So if revenue growth can be misleading, where exactly does fragility hide? So let's start with the most common trap: restricted versus unrestricted. This is what I call the flexibility trap. So many nonprofits are what I could call cash rich and flexibility poor. When most of your revenue is restricted, you cannot easily reallocate funds during a crisis. That's one. Two, you cannot invest in infrastructure without negotiation, because most of the time you find that we avoid to include infrastructure costs in these kinds of restricted grants. And three, you cannot absorb delayed reimbursement cycles. Then four, you cannot actually build meaningful operating reserves from restricted grants. And yet boards celebrate total revenue growth. But here is one of the uncomfortable truths that I can share. Restricted income can actually mask liquidity stress. For example, if 80 to 90% of your funding is earmarked for specific outputs, your organization becomes operationally busy, but it's strategically constrained. And in multi-country environments, this can even be multiples. Like, for example, you have different donors with different rules, different reporting standards, different currencies, and also different reimbursement structures. So if you're not actively tracking your restricted to restricted ratio, you are managing optics and not sustainability. Revenue volume does not equal to flexibility, as we all know, and flexibility is actually what buys resilience. So, but even if you improve your funding matrix, the mix between the two, there's another assumption that quietly weakens organizations, and that's what we call liquidity. Because you saw liquidity is not sustainability. You'll hear maybe we have 3 months of reserves, and my question is always 3 months of what? Program expenditure? Is it cooperating costs? Is it for maybe in situations where we have headquarters and other country operations, is it only covering one geography or full country level obligations? So especially in global nonprofits, liquidity must be assessed at multiple layers. So what happens? You must look at the consolidating entity. You must look at your regional or country hubs, because there are organizations that appear liquid at the headquarters, while country operations, where one delayed reimbursement, away from the payroll stalls. And so this is what will not be resilience. True liquidity strategy considered: one, grant payment timing mismatch; two, foreign exchange volatility; three, intercompany balances; then four, we can talk about emergency response obligations; and then five, political instability exposures. So these are all the things that we must consider when we are building our liquidity strategy across borders, because liquidity buffer should reflect your volatility profile, not just the textbook percentage. 3 months might be sufficient in a stable environment, but it may be dangerously thin in a multi-country organization operating in high-risk environment. So now let's move to a blind spot that rarely appears in board dashboards, but quietly determines whether growth is sustainable: infrastructure. And I had talked about infrastructure and the machinery in my past video. So infrastructure underinvestment is the other hidden liability. Finance systems, internal controls, technology platforms, compliance capacity, and also talent depth. Very, very important. So these are often treated as overhead burdens in many circumstances, and they can easily be shoved aside when programs need to take the day. But what we know and what we must understand is that underinvested infrastructure is a liability that is disguised in as efficiency. If your system cannot handle scale, if reporting requires heroic effort every quarter, and if your finance team is chronically stretched, you are subsidizing growth with internal exhaustion. And exhaustion is not sustainable. And the tension usually comes in where donors want low overhead ratios, board wants visible growth, and organizations want credibility. But credible growth also requires the machinery. And machinery must be funded intentionally and not apologetically. So the mission is the promise, as we've said before. The machinery is what makes the promise executable. So if you starve the machinery, the mission eventually weakens. And even if you fix your infrastructure, one final blind spot can destabilize everything. Everything. Let's talk about concentration risk, the dependency risk, the concentration problem. How many organizations track donor dependency with the same seriousness they track expense variance? If one funder represents 40% of your revenue, 50% of your revenue, or even 60% of revenue, then you are not diversified. You are actually very exposed. And in global nonprofit, exposure multiplies because a bilateral donor shifts geopolitical priorities, and sometimes currency devaluation reduces grant value. I have seen this quite a lot in the recent past. And then also policy changes may delay disbursements. And I have seen organizations that are structurally healthy in operations but very vulnerable to a single funding decision made thousands of miles away. And again, I cannot remind us of what happened to the organizations that were operating purely on restricted grants funded by the USAID grant environment. When that grant came to a sudden halt, we saw the chaos that hit the nonprofit sector. So dependency analysis must be done, especially for organizations that are keen in building, in growing, in remaining sustainable. So we must have scenarios tested, and this should actually be reviewed at the board finance committee level. Otherwise, growth becomes a single point of failure strategy. So what's missing? What lens are most boards not applying? So let's look at the capital strategy lens. So most nonprofit boards ask, are we within budget? Are we compliant? Did we receive a clean audit? And a few will go ahead and ask, what is our capital strategy? So the capital strategy question asks, what funding mix protects flexibility? What liquidity buffer reflects our volatility? What infrastructure investment is non-negotiable? What donor concentration threshold is acceptable? And what growth pace protects control integrity? Because capital strategy shifts the conversation from survival to structural strength. And this is where most organizations begin to resemble mature institutions, not just mission-driven entities. And after nearly 2 decades in this sector, I've learned something very, very critical. The income statement tells you how you performed. That is the intention. The balance sheet tells you how long you can survive. And the cash flow statement tells you whether your optimism is funded. So in closing, I would say that growth is exciting, but resilience is deliberate. If your organization cannot operate for 6 months without new funding, cannot absorb delayed disbursements, cannot invest in its own infrastructure, and cannot withstand the exit of a single major donor, you are not scaling, you are stretching. And stretching without capital discipline will eventually snap. So for me, this is the question. Is the organization financially impressive or financially durable? Because for future of global nonprofits will belong to institutions that understand the capital strategy, not just program expansion. And if this resonates with you, please subscribe, because in the next video, I would love to go deeper into how to design a fund-ready capital architect that attracts both grants and investment capital without compromising our mission. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.